Montana Territory, 1882. In the shadow of the jagged Beartooth Mountains, where untamed wilderness met the stubborn will of those who dared to tame it, Flynn Zachary had long ago decided that love was a luxury meant for softer men in gentler places. At 26, his face, handsome despite the scar cutting across his left eyebrow, had forgotten how to form a genuine smile. His green eyes, sharp as a hawk's, surveyed the horizon with perpetual vigilance, never resting, never trusting. "The frontier takes everything you love," he would mutter to himself on cold nights when the coyote's howls seemed to mock his solitude. "Best not to love at all." Flynn adjusted his worn Stetson as he guided his sorrel gelding across the rolling grasslands of his modest cattle spread. 6 years of scratching out an existence on this unforgiving land had taught him one reliable truth: attachment was dangerous. His parents had loved each other fiercely, until a winter blizzard took his mother and left his father a shell of a man who eventually drank himself into an early grave. His brother had loved a pretty schoolteacher until smallpox swept through the settlement and left him burying the woman he'd planned to marry. No, Flynn Zachary had built his life around independence. His small herd of cattle, his cabin with its sturdy walls, and the 6 hired hands who kept a respectful distance were all he needed. He'd fashioned himself into the kind of man who could weather any storm alone, lean, capable, and unyielding. The kind of man who survived the frontier by keeping his heart locked away like gold in a bank vault. What Flynn could not know, as he rode fence line that crisp September morning, was that his carefully constructed fortress was about to face its greatest challenge. The sound reached him first, the desperate creak of wagon wheels straining against an unnatural angle. Then came voices, high with panic. Flynn crested the small rise and saw the scene unfolding below. A wagon tilted precariously at the edge of Cripple Creek, one wheel caught in the rocky embankment, threatening to pull the entire rig into the swollen waters. A young woman stood at the head of the team, clutching the bridles of 2 frantic horses, her slender frame somehow managing to hold them steady despite their nervous dancing. Even from a distance, Flynn could see she was fighting a losing battle. He spurred his horse without conscious thought, galloping down the slope and shouting, "Hold them steady. I am coming." The woman's head snapped up at his voice, relief washing over her features. As Flynn drew closer, he was struck by her composure in crisis. Her dark brown hair had mostly escaped its pins, cascading in waves past her shoulders. Her blue traveling dress was mud-splattered and torn at the hem, but she gripped those bridles with determined hands, speaking soothing words to the frightened animals. "Thank heavens," she called as he approached. "My uncle is trapped beneath the wagon." He was trying to brace it when the ground gave way. Flynn dismounted in one fluid motion, immediately assessing the situation. The wagon was indeed moments from toppling into the creek. Beneath its tilted frame he could see boots protruding and hear a man's pained groans. "I will take the horses," Flynn said, reaching for the bridles. "When I give the word, you crawl under and help your uncle move clear. That wagon will not hold much longer." Their hands brushed as she relinquished the reins, and Flynn was struck by the warmth of her fingers despite the morning chill. Her eyes, he now saw, were a deep violet blue, filled with both fear and determination. "I am Genevieve Northcott," she said quickly. "My Uncle Walter and I were headed to Silver Gulch." "Flynn Zachary," he nodded curtly. "My ranch is 2 miles east. Now on my count you go to your uncle, 1, 2, 3. As Flynn held the team steady, Genevieve dropped to her knees and scrambled beneath the wagon. He could hear her urgent whispers as she helped the older man inch his way free. The wagon groaned, timbers splintering under the strain. "Hurry," Flynn shouted, feeling the horses growing more agitated by the second. With a final desperate effort, Genevieve emerged from beneath the wagon, helping a gray-haired man with a bloodied leg limp clear of the danger. Not a moment too soon, with a sickening crack, the wagon wheel gave way entirely, sending the vehicle crashing into the creek in a spray of water and broken wood. The horses lurched forward in panic, nearly pulling Flynn off his feet before he managed to calm them. When he had the team under control, he turned to find Genevieve kneeling beside her uncle, examining his injury. "The wheel caught him when it first slipped," she explained, tearing a strip from her petticoat to bind the wound. "I think his leg may be broken." Flynn studied the pair. The older man's face was ashen with pain, and the woman, Genevieve, looked exhausted beneath her calm exterior. Their wagon was destroyed, their possessions floating downstream. Silver Gulch is still 20 miles north, Flynn said, hearing the reluctance in his own voice even as he spoke. You will never make it with him injured. My ranch is closer. We could not impose, the older man began, wincing as he tried to sit up straighter. You do not have much choice, Flynn replied flatly. Night will be here in a few hours, and there are wolves in these parts. Genevieve looked up at him, those remarkable eyes assessing him carefully. We accept your kindness, Mr. Zachary, and will repay it as soon as we are able. Flynn almost corrected her. It was not kindness but practicality driving his offer, but something stopped him. Instead, he simply nodded and began making arrangements to transport the injured man. An hour later, Flynn found himself in a situation he had scrupulously avoided for years, hosting strangers in his home. His foreman Hank had helped him settle Walter Northcott in the spare room where Genevieve now tended to her uncle's injuries. Flynn stood awkwardly in his own kitchen, brewing coffee and wondering how his orderly life had been so thoroughly disrupted in a single afternoon. When Genevieve emerged from the bedroom, she had restored some order to her appearance. Her hair was neatly pinned again, her face freshly washed, though her dress remained travel-stained. My uncle is resting, she said, accepting the coffee Flynn offered. Thank you for opening your home to us, Mr. Zachary. Flynn, he corrected automatically. How bad is his leg? Not broken, I think, but badly sprained. He will need to stay off it for at least a week. She met his eyes directly. I know that complicates matters. A week. Flynn felt a flicker of alarm at the thought of this woman under his roof for 7 days. There was something about her direct gaze that made him uncomfortable, as though she could see past his carefully constructed barriers. We will manage, he said shortly. Where were you headed? Genevieve wrapped her hands around the warm mug before answering. Silver Gulch. My uncle has been appointed the new schoolteacher there. I came west to assist him and to. She hesitated, and Flynn found himself curious despite his better judgment. To what? To start fresh, she said finally. I am 22 years old, Mr. Zachary Flynn. In Boston, that practically makes me a spinster. Out here, I thought perhaps there might be different possibilities. Flynn nodded, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. You should get some rest. We rise early on ranch land. If she was offended by his abruptness, she did not show it. Of course, thank you again. Later that night, as Flynn made his final rounds of the property, checking that the cattle were secure and the hands had doused their campfire, he found himself thinking about Genevieve Northcott. There was a quality about her that unsettled him, not just her beauty, though she was undeniably beautiful, but a certain steadiness that seemed at odds with her refined Eastern manners. Trouble, he muttered to himself. Nothing but trouble. Yet when he finally retired to his own room, the house felt different knowing she slept under his roof. The silence that had been his faithful companion for so many years suddenly seemed empty rather than peaceful. Morning arrived with new complications. Flynn descended to his kitchen to find Genevieve already up, her sleeves rolled to her elbows as she expertly flipped flapjacks on his rarely used stove. I hope you do not mind, she said, glancing over her shoulder. I thought it the least I could do. Flynn stood frozen in the doorway. The domestic scene before him was so foreign to his experience that he hardly knew how to respond. The morning sun streaming through the window caught in her hair, revealing hints of auburn among the dark brown, and her cheeks were flushed from the heat of the stove. How is your uncle? He asked, sidestepping her question as he poured himself coffee. Resting comfortably, I changed his bandages, but he will need to remain abed today. She slid a plate of flapjacks toward him. I understand you have a ranch to run. Please do not feel you must entertain us. Flynn nodded, grateful for her understanding even as he wondered at her composure. Most Eastern women he had encountered would be in hysterics after yesterday's ordeal, yet here she stood, calmly cooking breakfast in a stranger's home as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I need to ride out to check the north pasture, he said. Will you be all right here alone? My hands stay in the bunkhouse, but I can have one remain if you. We will be perfectly fine, she assured him. I am more capable than I might appear, Mr. Zachary. Flynn almost smiled at that. I never suggested otherwise. For the first time, he saw a hint of uncertainty cross her features. In truth, I am not sure how we will proceed once my uncle can travel. Our wagon is destroyed and most of our possessions with it. We can worry about that when the time comes, Flynn replied, surprised by his own words. Normally, he would be counting the hours until his unwanted guests departed. Instead, he found himself adding, Silver Gulch will still be there in a week or two. She studied him for a moment, then smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face and sent an unexpected warmth through Flynn's chest. You are kinder than you pretend to be, Flynn Zachary. He left without responding, unsettled by her perception and by his own confusing reaction to her presence. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Flynn would rise early, often finding Genevieve already busy with some household task. They would exchange brief, somewhat awkward conversation before he departed for his daily work. In the evenings, he would return to find his cabin transformed, not with feminine frills or decorations, but with the simple evidence of care. Floors swept clean, dishes washed and put away, even his work shirts mended with tiny, precise stitches. Walter Northcott proved to be an educated, thoughtful man whose conversation Flynn found himself enjoying despite his inclination towards solitude. Over checkers games in the evening, the older man shared stories of Boston's literary circles and his theories on education that Flynn found surprisingly engaging. But it was Genevieve who truly disrupted the careful order of Flynn's existence. On the fourth day, he returned from mending fences to find her in his vegetable garden, expertly weeding between the rows of carrots and beans. Your garden has good bones, she called when she spotted him, but it was being strangled by weeds. Flynn dismounted, oddly defensive. I have been meaning to tend to it. Of course, she replied, her smile suggesting she did not believe him for a moment. Just as you have been meaning to repair that loose shutter and oil the hinges on the kitchen door. He stared at her, caught between irritation and something dangerously close to amusement. You have been busy. Idleness has never suited me. She stood, brushing soil from her hands. A streak of dirt marked her cheek, and without thinking, Flynn reached out to brush it away. The moment his fingers touched her skin, he froze, suddenly aware of his presumption. Genevieve went still as well, her eyes widening slightly. Dirt, he explained awkwardly, withdrawing his hand as though burned. Thank you, she murmured, color rising in her cheeks as she quickly changed the subject. I found some late-season berries by the creek. I thought I might make a pie if that would not be an imposition on your supplies. Flynn, still unsettled by the moment of contact, merely nodded. Use whatever you need. That evening, the scent of fresh-baked pie filled the cabin, drawing two of his ranch hands to the door with transparent excuses about needing Flynn's input on cattle matters. He sent them away with slices of pie, ignoring their knowing grins. After dinner, Walter retired early, leaving Flynn and Genevieve alone by the fire. The silence between them felt weighted with unspoken thoughts. You have a good life here, she said finally, gazing around the cabin, though it seems a lonely one. Flynn stiffened. I prefer it that way. Do you? She looked at him directly, those remarkable eyes reflecting the firelight. Or is that simply what you have told yourself to make the loneliness bearable? No one had dared speak to him so bluntly in years. Flynn felt anger rise within him, but beneath it lay something more frightening, the unsettling sense that she had seen through his carefully constructed defenses. You know nothing about me or my life, he said coldly. I know you built this ranch alone, she countered. I know you keep everyone at a distance, even your own men. I know you are kind despite your efforts to appear otherwise. And I know something wounded you deeply enough that you believe isolation is safer than connection. Flynn stood abruptly. It is late, you should rest. He escaped to the porch, drawing in deep breaths of the cool night air. The stars spread in a brilliant canopy above him, normally a source of comfort in their constancy. Tonight, they only emphasized how small and insignificant his self-imposed isolation was in the grand scheme of the universe. The door opened behind him and he knew without turning that Genevieve had followed him out. I apologize, she said quietly. I spoke out of turn. Flynn kept his eyes on the distant mountains. Your observations were not entirely inaccurate. She came to stand beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his as she too gazed at the night sky. "My fiancé died 3 years ago," she said unexpectedly. "Typhoid fever took him a month before our wedding. For a long time afterward, I thought it would be easier never to care for anyone again." Flynn glanced at her, surprised by her confession. "What changed?" "I realized that in protecting myself from pain, I was also denying myself joy." Her voice was soft but steady, and eventually the absence of both became its own kind of death. Something in her words pierced Flynn more deeply than he cared to admit. For years, he had prided himself on his self-sufficiency, his immunity to the emotional entanglements that complicated other men's lives. Yet standing beside this woman who had faced loss and chosen to remain open to life despite it, he felt not strong but diminished. "It is different out here," he said finally. "The frontier takes everything eventually. Caring only makes the loss harder when it comes." Genevieve was quiet for a long moment. "Perhaps," she said finally, "or perhaps caring is what makes any of it worthwhile in the first place." She returned inside, leaving Flynn alone with thoughts he had avoided for years. The next morning brought an unexpected change to their routine. As Flynn prepared to ride out, Genevieve appeared dressed in a simple skirt and blouse, her hair braided practically down her back. "I would like to accompany you today," she announced, "if that would not be an imposition." Flynn frowned. "My work is not suitable for a lady." Her eyes flashed with a hint of temper. "I assure you, Mr. Zachary, I am not so delicate as you imagine. Before my parents died, we had a small farm in Connecticut. I am no stranger to physical labor." Flynn studied her determined expression and found himself reluctantly impressed by her spirit. "Very well, can you ride?" "Since childhood." An hour later, Flynn found himself revising his assessment of Genevieve Northcott yet again. She rode well, not with the decorative posture taught to Eastern ladies, but with the practical confidence of someone who understood horses. When they stopped to repair a section of fence damaged by a fallen tree, she dismounted without assistance and immediately began gathering the scattered tools. "Hold these steady," Flynn instructed, indicating the fence posts he was attempting to reset. He half expected her to struggle with the task, but she braced the posts firmly, her slender arms stronger than they appeared. As they worked side by side under the vast Montana sky, Flynn found himself relaxing in her presence. She asked intelligent questions about the ranch operation and shared stories of her own experiences that made him see his familiar world through fresh eyes. "You seem to truly love this land," she observed as they paused to rest, looking out over the rolling grasslands stretching toward the distant mountains. "It demands everything from a person," Flynn replied, "but it gives something in return that cannot be found elsewhere." "Freedom," she said, understanding in her voice. He nodded, surprised by her perception. "Yes. Despite its hardships, or perhaps because of them, there is a kind of freedom here that exists nowhere else." "Is that why you came west, for freedom?" Flynn hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing his personal history. Yet something about the genuine interest in her expression prompted him to answer honestly. "My father brought us west after my mother died. He was running from grief, though I did not understand that as a boy. He claimed he was looking for gold, but I think he was really looking for oblivion." Flynn's voice grew distant with memory. "He found it at the bottom of a whiskey bottle when I was 17. My brother and I kept moving, working ranch jobs until we could save enough to buy our own place." "And your brother," she asked gently, "typhoid like your fiancé 4 years ago." "He was planning to marry the schoolteacher in Silver Springs." Genevieve's expression softened with compassion, but blessedly she offered no platitudes. "So you continued alone." It seemed simpler that way. Their eyes met, and Flynn was struck by the understanding he saw in her gaze, not pity, but a recognition born of similar experience. "Thank you for telling me," she said simply. The moment hung between them, fragile and significant. Then a distant rumble of thunder broke the spell, and Flynn glanced at the horizon to see dark clouds gathering. Storms coming. "We should head back." They rode hard, racing the approaching weather, but the storm moved faster. Heavy raindrops began to pelt them when they were still a mile from the ranch. By the time they reached a line shack Flynn maintained for just such emergencies, they were both drenched to the skin. Flynn hurried Genevieve inside the small wooden structure, then went to secure the horses in the attached lean-to. When he returned, she was standing in the center of the one-room cabin, water streaming from her clothes and forming puddles on the plank floor. "Not much, but it is dry," Flynn said, moving to start a fire in the small stove. "There should be some blankets in that trunk." Genevieve found the blankets while Flynn coaxed flames from the kindling. When he turned, he found her hesitating, clearly uncomfortable in her soaked clothing but uncertain about the propriety of changing with him present. "I will step outside while you change," he offered stiffly. "And get even more drenched? That would be foolish." She lifted her chin with determined practicality. "Turn your back, please." Flynn complied, facing the stove and focusing intensely on feeding the growing fire. Behind him, he could hear the rustle of wet fabric, the soft sounds of her movements as she struggled with sodden garments. "This is rather absurd," she said, a nervous laugh in her voice. "I feel like a half-drowned cat." "The storm should pass quickly," Flynn replied, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the stove. "We can wait it out here." "There," she said finally. "I am decent, or as decent as one can be wrapped in a blanket like an Indian papoose." Flynn turned to find her seated on the room's single chair, a rough wool blanket wrapped tightly around her. Her wet clothes hung from nails on the wall and her dark hair hung in damp waves over her shoulders. Despite the awkwardness of the situation, she managed a smile. "Your turn, I think. You are dripping on the floor." Flynn realized he was indeed creating his own puddle. "I have spare clothes in the trunk." He retrieved a worn flannel shirt and faded denims, then hesitated, far more uncomfortable with disrobing than she had appeared to be. Genevieve, sensing his discomfort, diplomatically turned her attention to the small window, watching the rain lash against the glass as Flynn quickly changed behind her. "The rain is beautiful in its way," she commented. "So different from Boston storms, everything here seems more immediate, more essential." Flynn, now dressed in dry clothes, hung his wet garments beside hers. "That is an accurate observation. The frontier strips away pretense. A person is exactly what they are out here, nothing more." "Is that why you stayed after your brother died? Because the frontier allows you to be exactly who you are?" Flynn considered the question as he settled on the edge of the small cot that served as the shack's bed. "Partly, and partly because I had nowhere else to go. You could have returned east. A man with your abilities would find work anywhere." "The East has too many people, too many rules." Flynn stared into the fire. "Too many expectations about how a man should live his life." Genevieve studied him thoughtfully. "You mean expectations of family, of connection?" Flynn met her gaze, struck again by her perception. "Yes." "And yet you rescued us without hesitation," she pointed out. "You opened your home to strangers. Those are not the actions of a man who truly wishes to remain disconnected." Before Flynn could formulate a response, a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Genevieve startled visibly, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulder to reveal the delicate curve of her collarbone. Flynn quickly averted his eyes, but not before a jolt of awareness had passed through him. "The storm is directly overhead now. It should move on soon." "I am not afraid," she said, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor, "just startled." Another crash of thunder shook the small building, and this time Genevieve did flinch. Without thinking, Flynn moved to sit beside her, offering the silent comfort of his presence. "My brother was afraid of thunderstorms," he said, surprising himself with the admission, even as a grown man. "He would never admit it, but I always knew." Genevieve's expression softened. "You miss him very much." It was not a question, but Flynn nodded anyway. "He was the better of us, kinder. More open to life. Like you are beneath your carefully maintained reserve," she suggested gently. Flynn looked at her then, really looked at her, this woman who had arrived in his life like a sudden storm, disrupting the careful patterns he had established. In the flickering light of the fire, with her hair drying in soft waves around her face and her eyes reflecting the warmth of the flames, she was breathtakingly beautiful. But it was more than her beauty that affected him. It was the quiet strength in her gaze, the intelligence in her observations, the resilience that had brought her west despite her losses. "You see too much, Genevieve Northcott," he said softly. "Or perhaps just enough," she replied, her voice equally soft. The air between them seemed to change, charged with possibility. Flynn became acutely aware of her nearness, of the slight parting of her lips, of his own heartbeat accelerating in his chest. For a suspended moment he thought he might lean forward, might cross the narrow space between them. The urge to do so was nearly overwhelming. Instead, he stood abruptly. "The rain is letting up. We should return before your uncle worries." Something like disappointment flickered across her features before she nodded, composing herself. Yes, of course. They rode back to the ranch in a silence more charged than comfortable, each lost in private thoughts. Flynn found himself unsettled by what had nearly happened in the Line shack, not just the almost kiss, but the unexpected openness he had shown her. For years, he had carefully guarded his past and his emotions. Yet in her presence, his defenses seemed to crumble of their own accord. It was dangerous. She was dangerous, with her perceptive gaze and her quiet questions that reached places inside him he had thought safely locked away. Walter greeted their return with evident relief, and Flynn retreated to the barn, grateful for the excuse of tending to the horses. He needed distance to regain his equilibrium, to rebuild the walls that Genevieve had so effortlessly breached. But as he worked, a new thought surfaced, unwelcome yet persistent. What if she was right? What if his isolation was not strength but fear? What if, in protecting himself from pain, he had also denied himself the very things that made life worthwhile? The following morning, Flynn rose before dawn and slipped out without breakfast, avoiding any chance of encountering Genevieve. He rode to the far boundary of his property, throwing himself into physical labor, mending fences, clearing brush, anything to exhaust his body and quiet his mind. It was nearly dusk when he returned, only to find an unexpected scene at his ranch. A wagon stood in the yard, and beside it, Genevieve was deep in conversation with a well-dressed man Flynn didn't recognize. Walter sat on the porch, his injured leg propped up on a stool. Flynn approached cautiously, noting the way the stranger stood too close to Genevieve, his posture suggesting familiarity. A cold knot formed in Flynn's stomach. "Flynn," Walter called, spotting him first, "come meet our visitor. This is Elijah Price, Silver Gulch's mayor. He has come to escort us to town." Flynn dismounted slowly, studying the newcomer. Price was perhaps 40, expensively dressed despite the dust of travel, with a meticulously groomed beard and an air of self-importance that Flynn instinctively disliked. "Zachary," Price greeted him with a nod that managed to be simultaneously polite and dismissive. "The Northcotts have told me how you assisted them. The town appreciates your good deed." "It was no deed," Flynn replied stiffly. "Anyone would have done the same." "Nevertheless," Price continued, placing a proprietary hand on Genevieve's arm, "we are eager to welcome our new schoolteacher properly. I have arranged suitable accommodations in town." Genevieve extricated herself from Price's touch with subtle grace. "Mayor Price was concerned when we did not arrive as scheduled," she explained to Flynn. "He kindly came to investigate." "And fortuitously brought a wagon," Walter added. "We can depart in the morning if that suits." Flynn nodded, ignoring the hollow feeling expanding in his chest. Of course they would leave. That had always been the plan. They had lives waiting in Silver Gulch, important roles to fill, new connections to make. Their stay at his ranch had been nothing more than a temporary necessity. "Will you join us for dinner, Mayor?" Genevieve asked, though Flynn noticed a certain reserve in her manner. "I would be delighted," Price replied, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made Flynn's jaw tighten. Dinner proved to be a strained affair. Price dominated the conversation with tales of Silver Gulch's growing prosperity and his own role in securing it. He paid particular attention to Genevieve, peppering his stories with compliments and thinly veiled indications of his interest in her. "A young woman of your refinement will be a welcome addition to our community," he said, smiling at her across the table. "We have several respectable families, of course, but few ladies of true culture. Miss Northcott comes west to teach alongside her uncle, not to adorn your social gatherings," Flynn found himself saying, the words escaping before he could check them. An uncomfortable silence followed his interruption. Price raised his eyebrows in mild surprise, while Walter cleared his throat nervously. "Of course, her educational contributions will be most valuable," Price conceded smoothly. But I see no reason why she cannot also grace our social life. A woman of Miss Northcott's beauty and accomplishments deserves appreciation. Flynn said nothing more, but he felt Genevieve's gaze on him, questioning and thoughtful. After dinner, Price took his leave to prepare for their departure the following day. "I will return at dawn," he promised. "The journey to Silver Gulch is not arduous, but I prefer to arrive before nightfall." When he had gone, Walter excused himself to rest, leaving Flynn and Genevieve alone in uncomfortable silence. "Mayor Price seems quite attentive," Flynn said finally, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Genevieve's expression was unreadable as she gathered the dinner dishes. "He has been most accommodating. I imagine he accommodates all beautiful women who arrive in his town." Her hand stilled at his words. "Are you implying something, Mr. Zachary?" The return to formality stung more than Flynn expected, only that his interest seems to extend beyond your teaching qualifications. "And that concerns you because," her violet blue eyes held his, challenging him to acknowledge what lay unspoken between them. Flynn looked away first. "It does not concern me at all. I merely thought you should be aware of his intentions." "I am not naive, Flynn," her voice softened slightly. "I recognize the nature of his interest." "And do you welcome it?" The question escaped before Flynn could stop it, revealing more than he intended. Genevieve set the dishes down deliberately and faced him fully. "Would it matter to you if I did?" It was the moment of truth, the moment to either acknowledge the connection that had formed between them or to retreat behind the walls he had so carefully constructed. Flynn hesitated too long. The openness in Genevieve's expression faded, replaced by a dignified reserve that was somehow worse than anger would have been. "I see," she said quietly. "Well then. I should finish packing our things for tomorrow's departure." She left him standing alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life she had temporarily brought to his home: fresh curtains at the windows, wildflowers in a jar on the table, the lingering scent of apple pie. All of it would be gone tomorrow, along with her. Flynn stepped onto the porch, drawing in the cool night air as if it might clear the confusion in his mind. The sensible part of him knew her departure was for the best. She belonged in civilization, among people who could appreciate her brightness, her warmth. He had chosen isolation long ago, had built his life around self-sufficiency. Yet the thought of her leaving, of never again seeing her smile or hearing her thoughtful questions or watching her braid her hair in the morning sunlight, created a hollow ache in his chest that no amount of reason could dispel. Dawn arrived with a clarity that seemed to mock Flynn's sleepless night. He had spent hours wrestling with emotions he had long denied, alternating between resolute acceptance of Genevieve's departure and desperate schemes to ask her to stay. In the end, he had reached no resolution except the knowledge that he had never felt so torn. He was saddling his horse when Mayor Price's wagon appeared on the horizon. Flynn had no intention of being present for the farewells. He would ride out to check the western pasture, returning only after they were gone. It was cowardly, perhaps, but the thought of watching Genevieve leave with Price was more than he could bear. He was tightening the saddle's cinch when her voice came from behind him. "Were you planning to leave without saying goodbye?" Flynn turned to find Genevieve standing in the barn doorway, her traveling dress buttoned to the neck, her hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. She looked every inch the respectable schoolteacher she was to become. "I thought it would be easier," he admitted. "Easier for whom?" There was a challenge in her voice, though her expression remained gentle. Flynn had no answer that would not reveal too much. "Your escort has arrived." "Yes, I saw." She stepped further into the barn, her gaze steady on his face. "Flynn, before I go, I need to ask you something." He nodded, bracing himself. "These past days, did they mean anything to you, or am I simply a temporary disruption to your carefully ordered life?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. "You know they meant something." "Do I?" She moved closer, close enough that he could see the individual lashes framing those remarkable eyes. "You have given me nothing but contradictions. One moment you share your past, your thoughts in ways that suggest connection. The next, you retreat behind walls so thick I cannot reach you." Flynn's heart hammered in his chest. "Genevieve." "I do not need pretty words or false promises," she continued. "But I do need honesty. If you feel nothing beyond neighborly concern, tell me now, and I will go to Silver Gulch and build a new life without looking back." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and peril. Flynn stood at a crossroads he had never anticipated reaching, forced to choose between the safety of isolation and the terrifying vulnerability of connection. "I feel," he began, the words catching in his throat. "I feel as though my life was in perfect order until you arrived. I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. Now everything is unsettled." Disappointment flickered across her features, but Flynn pressed on. "But I also feel that the order I clung to was empty, that in protecting myself from pain I had also walled myself off from joy." He took a shaky breath. "The thought of you leaving makes me realize how alone I have been, and how alone I will be again when you go." Hope dawned in her eyes, cautious but unmistakable. "And if I were to stay?" "You have obligations in Silver Gulch. Your uncle needs you." "My uncle," she said softly, "has spent the past week observing what happens between us. This morning he suggested that perhaps my place is not in Silver Gulch after all." Flynn stared at her, hardly daring to believe what she seemed to be suggesting. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that there are other schools that need teachers, that my uncle is perfectly capable of teaching alone as he has done for decades, that Mayor Price's attentions, while flattering, hold no appeal for me." Her voice grew softer still. "I am saying that I have found something unexpected here, something I thought I might never find again after losing Thomas." Flynn's hand moved of its own accord, reaching out to brush a strand of hair that had escaped her bonnet. "I cannot offer you the comforts of town life. My home is plain, the work never-ending." "I did not come west seeking comfort," she replied, a smile warming her features. "I came seeking purpose, connection. A place where I could be more than just an aging spinster or a tragic figure still mourning her fiancé." "And have you found that here?" Flynn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believe I have found the beginning of it." "The possibility of it," her gaze held his, unflinching in its honesty, "but it requires your courage as well as mine." From the yard came the sound of Walter's voice, greeting Mayor Price. Time was running short. "Stay," Flynn said, the word emerging as both request and plea. "Not as a guest or a temporary arrangement, but as—" "As what, Flynn Zachary?" Genevieve prompted, her eyes shining with what might have been unshed tears or merely the reflection of morning light. "As my wife," he finished, the words releasing something tight and painful in his chest. "If you would consider such an offer from a man who has only just discovered he has a heart to give." Her smile bloomed slowly, transforming her already beautiful face into something radiant. "I would consider it very carefully," she answered, a teasing note entering her voice. "After all, I hardly know you." "You know me better than anyone has in years," Flynn replied seriously. "You saw past my walls from the first day." "Then yes," she said simply, "yes, I will stay." Flynn's restraint finally broke. He pulled her to him, one hand cradling the back of her head as his lips found hers in a kiss that held years of pent-up emotion, tenderness and passion, and the sweet relief of finally coming home after a long, lonely journey. When they finally broke apart, Genevieve's cheeks were flushed, her bonnet askew. "We should speak to my uncle," she said breathlessly, "and Mayor Price." Flynn nodded, though he was reluctant to release her. "Will your uncle approve?" "He hardly knows me." "He knows enough," she assured him, "and he wants my happiness above all." Together, they walked from the barn to face the waiting men. Walter's expression, when Flynn formally requested permission to marry his niece, was one of quiet satisfaction rather than surprise. Mayor Price, however, looked thunderstruck. "But Miss Northcott, what of your position at the school?" he protested. "The children of Silver Gulch are counting on your instruction." "My uncle will provide excellent education without my assistance," Genevieve replied firmly. "And perhaps in time Flynn and I might establish a small school here for the children of neighboring ranches." Price turned to Flynn, his expression hardening. "This is rather sudden, Zachary. One might almost suspect impropriety in your intentions." Flynn's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Walter intervened. "Mayor Price, I assure you that Mr. Zachary's intentions toward my niece are entirely honorable. I have observed their growing attachment and given it my blessing." The older man's tone was mild but firm. "Now, if you would be so kind as to convey me to Silver Gulch, I have a school term to prepare for." Price had no choice but to acquiesce, though his departing glance at Flynn held clear warning. When the wagon disappeared over the horizon, carrying Walter to his new post, Flynn found himself standing in his yard with Genevieve beside him, the future suddenly wide open with possibilities he had never allowed himself to imagine. "Are you certain," he asked her one last time, "your life will be harder here than in town?" Genevieve slipped her hand into his, her touch warm and reassuring. "I am certain that I would rather face hardship with you than ease without you." In that moment, Flynn finally understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. That the frontier did indeed take everything eventually, but that was precisely why love mattered. Because in the face of the wilderness, in the shadow of loss and hardship, human connection was not weakness but strength, the only real defense against the isolation that truly killed the spirit. 2 months later, on a crisp November morning, Flynn Zachary married Genevieve Northcott in a simple ceremony attended by his ranch hands, a few neighboring families, and Walter, who made the journey from Silver Gulch to give away his niece. The bride wore a blue dress that matched her eyes, with wildflowers in her dark hair, and the groom could not take his eyes from her face as they spoke their vows. That night, as they lay together in the bedroom now transformed by Genevieve's presence, Flynn confessed the fear that had kept him isolated for so long. "I believed that loving someone meant eventually losing them," he murmured, his fingers tracing the delicate line of her collarbone. "That the frontier would take you as it took everyone else I cared for." Genevieve propped herself up on one elbow, her hair falling in a curtain around them. "The frontier takes what it will with or without our permission," she said softly. "But it also gives, it gave me you." Flynn pulled her close, marveling at how completely she had transformed his life, not by changing his circumstances, but by changing how he saw them. His ranch was the same. The work remained challenging, the frontier still presented daily threats. But with Genevieve beside him, these elements no longer represented isolation but possibility. In the years that followed, that possibility blossomed into reality. The small school Genevieve established in one of the ranch outbuildings drew children from miles around. The garden she had first weeded expanded to provide vegetables for their table and extras to share with neighbors. And 2 years after their wedding, their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's violet blue eyes and her father's determined spirit. Flynn Zachary, who had once believed the frontier allowed only for survival, discovered instead that it had offered him the greatest gift of all. A life fully lived with all its joys and sorrows, its challenges and triumphs. A life shared. And on nights when he stood on his porch watching the stars wheel overhead while his wife and child slept safely inside, he thought of the man he had been before Genevieve came along, the man who had believed his heart was permanently closed, and he marveled at how completely wrong he had been. For it was not weakness to love in the face of potential loss, but the greatest courage. And in the vast, unforgiving beauty of the American frontier, it was that courage, more than any other quality, that truly allowed a person not merely to survive, but to thrive.